Hello, 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 and thank you guys for joining me, Trenton Ty, once again here on the SteelCast, where I get to talk about blacksmithing, and I really enjoy talking. So today, I think I have almost disappointed a bunch of people because the past SteelCasts have been very concise. They've been very to the point, and I think people are used to me rambling a little bit more. And in fact, one of the fellows that actually reviews some of this stuff for me is like, you may need to add in a few more stories. I'm like, my God, that's like, boy, have I made the mistake of growing up and becoming mature? Don't know, but I'm going to make up for it in this particular SteelCast. Originally, I had meant for this SteelCast to be about tooling and getting tooled up in the shop, but I ended up telling a story about Jay and realized that I could make this entire podcast a really good story about Jay and also make a very important point that is directed to you beginners and that can really help not only you have a different way of thinking, but prevent you from looking a little dumb. All right, so let me give you some of the background here. There's a gentleman that I had recently met that had commented on one of my posts, and I want to say up front that this fella did not mean any insult, did not mean any issue. He asked an honest question, and that is the way I took it. However, the question that he asked showed so much of what he did not know and probably had fallen victim to other people that really had more to talk about than their hind end merited. How about that, right? So here's the deal. I had put a post up about a day's work. And recently, if you guys have been seeing some of the beautiful axe work we've been doing out of the railroad track, all available on TrentonTide.com, by the way. I had said that these 10 axe heads, and I think it was 2 knife blades, this was a day's work for me. And his comment was, he says, well, you must not be doing traditional blacksmithing. You must be doing modern blacksmithing because if I tried to make all those axes in a day, my arm would fall off. So if you don't know, here's the problem with that. And this goes back to even when Jay Riekert, the guy that taught me, started blacksmithing. And here's the problem. So many beginners, and it's the older guys, it's usually not the younger guys. This is an older guy retiree problem. They get into blacksmithing and they have a certain idea of what blacksmithing's supposed to be. And it's supposed to be old-timey, traditional, et cetera, right? And for some reason, there's a mania that comes with that. We used to call these guys stitch counters back in the reenactment community. This was the guy that would come around and check the number of stitches in your authentic shirt collar to make sure it was 100% authentic. Nobody liked that guy. Technically, he was right, but nobody liked that guy. It was a pox on things. And these guys are usually the ones that ended up causing the worst problems in the group, right? To a degree, that's what happens with the blacksmiths. When these new guys get into it, they become just fervent, just like psychotic about this is traditional and this is modern and there's no in-between, et cetera, et cetera. Even Jay Riekert, the guy that taught me, suffered from this, and that's the story that I want to tell you guys. So when Jay first got into blacksmithing in the early 70s, he was one of the first Civil War reenactors down here in the South. That's when they all had polyester uniforms, right? But Jay was learning about blacksmithing, and Jay went up to a place called Madison. This is outside of Atlanta, and every 2 years, Madison has a blacksmithing conference. Jay went up there specifically to learn how to forge weld from a guy named Judd Nelson. And Judd Nelson's a bit of a legend back in the blacksmithing circles. He's one of the real smiths from back in the day. And up until that point, while Jay had been a reenactor there at Andersonville, Jay had pretty much been the blacksmith equivalent of a stitch counter. Anything that was modern was covered up and hidden. If he did the work, it was absolutely painstakingly by hand and in the old fashioned, at least what he thought was the old fashioned. And that's just the way it was. If you were going to do 1860s blacksmithing, it had to be traditional. Well, the problem was when he went up to Madison, Jay steps onto the property, and I remember this very particular quote. He said, in broad daylight, they were using power hammers to do work, as if this was like the local cat house operating out in public view, right? And that's how Jay took it, you know. And Jay was just dumbfounded. I mean, he was blown away that these people would be using power equipment out in the open. He said after some introspection, though, he came to understand what was happening is that the right tool for the right job was being used to produce good work. There was an effort to hide anything modern as far as the welds and things like that, but the end result was high quality ironwork. And Jay's perspective on everything shifted from there, absolutely from there on. And in my time, I did suffer from a little bit about that myself until I got my first power hammer. And I'm going to tell you something, boys and girls. If you're a guy that is in his backyard and you have a hand hammer and somebody says, hey, you need a power hammer, your reply unequivocally should be yes. Now, you can follow that up with, but I don't have the money, or this is just a hobby. If you ever use the excuse of, I like to do it the old way, you are a big steaming pile of horse crap, because that means that you do not know blacksmithing. A power hammer is the ticket to the next world of ironwork. And if you say that, well, that's not traditional, now I'm about to spank your behind. Because the earliest examples that we have of power hammers come from China, and that's before the birth of Christ. Let me say that again. Power hammers, water hammers, tilt hammers have been around before the birth of Christ. If you think about it for a moment, think of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that were equipped with iron swords and shields and armor. Do you think it was only arm power that equipped all those men? No. The first ironmongers, the people that actually made the iron, they were using tilt hammers, 200-300-pound hammerheads to do that particular work. If it had not been for the early invention of the power hammer, we would not have anything of what we have today. So when you come to me and you say, well, you're using a power hammer, you're not traditional, that's a very foolish thing to say. So are you going to draw the distinction because instead of a water wheel powering my hammer, that I need to make sure, there's an electric motor and therefore that's not traditional? So you understand the point that I'm making here is that there's a lot of people that are going to have to take the pine cone out of their buttocks because traditional blacksmithing absolutely 100% involves a power hammer. And there was a great book that came out called Pounding Out the Profits. It was about how a blacksmith should use a power hammer. And I'm going to tell you something. The mechanical power hammer, the little giants and things of that nature, revolutionized the small blacksmith shop because not every blacksmith shop could have a water wheel. But when that power hammer came out and it now could be put into the smaller shop, you talk about an explosion of productivity and capability. One of the things about doing blacksmith work and working with the steel, well, let me explain something. My guilty pleasure, working with wood. I love woodworking, and one of the reasons is because I can take a 36 grit belt and eat a 2x4 in half in a second. I can't do that with steel. Steel is difficult to move. By its very nature, it takes so long to get it to do whatever it is that you want it to do. Wood, that's the easy part, right? And if you're doing it with a hand hammer, it's even worse. One of the things that was so amazing when I first got my power hammer was that it freed me from fighting the material. Moving the material was always a fight. My arm would wear out, especially when I was working anything over a 1/2 inch thick. I mean, that's a lot of steel to hit with a hammer. But when I had the power hammer, suddenly I did not have to focus on, oh my God, my arm's about to fall off, or it's hot, or I'm extra tired and I'm breathing hard. I got to focus on the work. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most important things when it comes to being creative with the medium. If you spend all your time and all your energy fighting the material, you have very little left for the creative process. And this is especially true when it comes to the art side of it. And just like those axes, yes, that means that if I take a hard day, I can literally take railroad track right out of the scrapyard and make 12 axe heads in a day. And that day I did actually 2 long dagger blades as well. Absolutely 100% did it. And my arm wasn't blown out. The tendons weren't hanging out like shredded meat on that end of it. And I was ready to go to work the next day to get the axe heads finished up and put into handles, right? Tooling is king. Traditional does not mean what you think it does. So as an overall point, and I'll wrap this up pretty quick. I've been running my mouth for about 10 minutes. One of the most important things you can do is that as you go into your blacksmithing journey, the answer to do you need more tooling? The answer is yes. Now, my God, I got to tell you, I'm really kind of amazed because I have an extra box that sits out back. That for all of the old Hardy tools that I've made, and in my time, I must have constructed well over 200 or 300 Hardy tools. Just in the past several years. I've just literally got them stacked up. A lot of them were made specifically for one job, and you don't want to throw it away, so it kind of goes back into the pile. And I am just staggered at the accumulation of those specific tools. And I guarantee you, those tools are what allowed me to make a living, to do work. But it was because I was on top of it, and if I had a problem, I made a tool to fix it. That starts with the power hammer, and then everything follows from that. I got to looking at the rack the other day because when we do our peanut blade work, we make a special pair of tongs to hold our peanut blades. And at this point, I've probably made 20 pair because they wear out. The heating and the cooling is so intense on those tongs, they usually tend to wear out as far as breaking at the jaw on a pretty regular basis. We've been at the peanut blade thing now for, my God, 8-9 years. But as I was looking on the rack, I think I have 1 or 2 pair of tongs that are from somewhere else that were a manufactured pair of tongs or some old ones that I found. Everything else in my shop are tongs and this is how it usually happened. I had the wrong pair of tongs, and I finally got too hot and I finally got too PO'd. I couldn't hold on to what I did, and I said, screw it, shut it down. I'm making the right tongs for this. That has happened more times than I like to count. And, on a side note, that's the other thing you guys are going to have to find out where that line is, because there is no great rule. If you're making 3 of them, do you need specialty tooling? That is an eternal fight, because if you don't do it, things aren't going to be lined up as perfect as you do. And if you do it, you're going to spend a day making the tooling to do 3 items. So there's a real gray zone in there on when to make tooling. But the real answer, if you're a properly disciplined business person, the time to make tooling is always. Now, if you do not know who Tony Swatton is arguably the most famous blacksmith in history. Now, I hope Tony's not going to spend the time to listen to this so I can talk about him here. So Tony Swatton works for the film industry, and you may not know that name, but you've seen his work. Tony, his first big role or his first big job was for Hook with Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman. He made the hook on that end of it. He also made all the swords. He did all the swords for Pirates of the Caribbean. He did pieces for Michael Jackson. And here recently, I got to help him on Star Wars. He did stuff for The Mandalorian. If you actually watch the Book of Boba Fett, where they're actually forging down the Beskar spear, if you'll notice, the hands forging it in those fancy gloves are kind of huge, whereas the actress that plays the armor, Emily Swallows, is a very tiny lady. So it's actually Tony forging this spear on camera. Tony also did Thanos' gauntlet, right? So that means that billions of people have seen his work, right? I mean, now Tony is a tool addict. In fact, he's got a guy that comes by to tell him that, some different equipment's come up. He refers to that guy as his pusher, right? And Tony's shop is stacked to the brim with all manner of esoteric tools. Nibblers, sheet metal tools. He's got a press he calls Mr. Squishy Pants that I think is like a 200-ton press. It's insanity. But the things that Tony can do as an individual, and not just do, but do quickly, because he works in Hollywood. And buddy, let me tell you what, these guys in Hollywood, let us say they really don't have their crap together for the most part. They will call you 6 weeks and say, hey, can you do this? And you say, yep, I'm ready for it. And you wait, and 3 days before they need it, they call you. Hey, can you still do this? And you're like, I told you there's like a 4-week lead time. Well, I know, but can you do this? And that's when you quadruple the price and say yes, and then you have to stay up all night with enough Red Bull to kill an elephant. That's what Tony does. How that man is still alive, I don't know. The point is, though, he is able to have enough tooling that there's really not anything he can't fabricate in short order. And as a result, this guy his work has been seen by more people, or flat out period. Billions have seen his work. Billions all around the world. And it is because he has the most toys. Okay? So guys, that's going to wrap it up. I want to thank you again for taking the time to listen to the SteelCast. I hope that was going to satisfy the folks there that need a few stories and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm going to try to make a point to talk a little bit more about the people that you need to know in the craft, because I think one of the big things is we absolutely need our heroes in the craft, and they're just not talked about that much. And Tony, I'm not going to call Tony a hero. He might hear this, but he is pretty awesome. And he is awesome, but I do kind of hate him. Because there is no story that you can tell around Tony that Tony doesn't have a better one. But more on that later. Anyway, guys, again, thank you so much for listening to the SteelCast. We're going to have more coming up over the next couple weeks. Thank you all so much, and I will catch you next time.